The piercing scream echoed across the still water at 3 a.m. But when Mia rushed to her lake house window, the moonlit surface was empty, just like the 11 other nights she'd heard it. Tonight, she would finally discover what lurked beneath the calm facade of her family's secluded retreat, and why every previous owner had fled in terror. These are 11 true stories of lake house horror that will make you question every shadow dancing on the water and every creak of the old wooden dock. The Thompson family had been coming to Lake Meredith for 3 generations. But Olivia had never experienced anything like the terror that began on their first night back in July 2022. What started as a peaceful family reunion at their beloved lake house would spiral into a nightmare that would forever change how they viewed their cherished retreat. Olivia and her husband James had driven up from Denver with their 2 young children, 8-year-old Evelyn and 6-year-old Henry, expecting nothing more than a week of swimming, fishing, and reconnecting with the tranquil waters that had been Olivia's childhood sanctuary. The lake house, a modest 2-story cabin with weathered cedar siding and a wraparound deck, sat on a secluded cove where the water was so still it reflected the pine trees like a mirror. The property had been in Olivia's family since 1952, passed down from her grandmother, who had built it as a summer escape from city life. The first day passed without incident. The children splashed in the shallow water near the dock, while Olivia and James unpacked and settled in. As evening approached, they grilled burgers on the deck and watched the sunset paint the lake in shades of orange and pink. The familiar sounds of loons calling across the water and the gentle lapping of waves against the shore filled Olivia with the same sense of peace she'd known since childhood. After putting the children to bed in the loft, Olivia and James sat on the deck with glasses of wine, discussing plans for the rest of the week. It was just past midnight when Olivia first heard them. The soft, deliberate sound of bare feet walking across the wooden dock. She jolted awake in the master bedroom, her heart immediately racing. The sound was unmistakable. Step, pause, moving slowly from one end of the dock to the other. James was still sleeping beside her, his breathing steady and undisturbed. Olivia strained to listen, wondering if perhaps it was just the dock settling or some nocturnal animal. But the rhythm was too purposeful, too human. She slipped out of bed and moved to the window that overlooked the lake. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the water. But a thick fog had rolled in from the far shore, creating an eerie veil that obscured much of the dock's far end. Olivia pressed her face to the glass, trying to make out any movement through the mist. The footsteps had stopped, but she could swear she saw a shadow moving near the end of the dock, just beyond where the fog grew thickest. Olivia's rational mind searched for explanations. Maybe it was a deer that had wandered onto the property, or perhaps a raccoon investigating the dock for food scraps. But as she watched, the shadow seemed to move with human-like deliberation, pausing at the very edge of the dock before disappearing entirely into the fog. She waited at the window for another 10 minutes, but the mysterious figure didn't reappear, and the footsteps didn't resume. The next morning, Olivia mentioned the incident to James over coffee on the deck. He listened with the patient expression of a husband who had learned to take his wife's concerns seriously. But she could see the skepticism in his eyes. Maybe it was just the dock shifting with the temperature change, he suggested. You know how wood expands and contracts. Olivia wanted to believe him, but she couldn't shake the memory of that purposeful rhythm, the way the footsteps had seemed to pause and consider before moving forward. They spent the day on the lake, taking the children out in the small motorboat and exploring the hidden coves they'd discovered over the years. Evelyn and Henry delighted in jumping off the dock into the cool water, their laughter echoing across the cove. For a while, Olivia forgot about the mysterious footsteps, caught up in the joy of watching her children experience the same freedom she had known at their age. But as night fell on their second evening, the fog began to roll in again, and Olivia felt a familiar anxiety settling in her chest. She found herself glancing repeatedly toward the dock as they ate dinner, watching for any sign of movement. James noticed her distraction and gently placed his hand on her arm. "Liv, you're going to drive yourself crazy if you keep looking for problems," he said softly. "This place has always been safe. Your family has been coming here for 70 years. Olivia nodded and tried to focus on the children's chatter about their plans for the next day. But as bedtime approached, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them in the fog. She checked and double-checked the locks on all the doors, something she'd never bothered to do in all her years at the lake house. The cabin had always felt like a haven, a place where the outside world couldn't intrude. But now she found herself questioning that assumption. At 3:17 a.m., the footsteps returned. This time, Olivia was already partially awake, her subconscious apparently attuned to the threat. The sound was exactly the same. Bare feet moving slowly across the wooden planks, pausing occasionally as if the walker was studying something or listening for sounds from the house. Olivia's heart hammered as she carefully extracted herself from bed, determined to get a better look at whatever was out there. She crept to the window and peered through the glass. The fog was even thicker than the night before, creating ghostly shapes that seemed to shift and move in the moonlight. But this time, Olivia could clearly see the dark outline of a figure standing at the end of the dock. It appeared to be a person of average height, completely still, facing toward the house. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she realized the figure seemed to be looking directly at her window. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Olivia remained frozen at the window, afraid to move or breathe too loudly, while the figure maintained its vigil at the end of the dock. Finally, as if sensing her gaze, the figure turned and began walking back toward the shore, the footsteps resuming their deliberate rhythm. Olivia watched in fascination and terror as the figure reached the shore end of the dock and simply vanished into the fog, leaving no trace of its presence. This time, Olivia woke James immediately. "There's someone out there," she whispered urgently, shaking his shoulder. "I saw them on the dock. They were watching the house." James, still groggy but alarmed by the fear in his wife's voice, got up and looked out the window. The fog had already begun to dissipate, and the dock stood empty in the moonlight. "Liv, there's nothing there," James said gently, but Olivia could hear the concern creeping into his voice. "Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" Olivia's frustration mounted as she tried to convince her husband of what she'd witnessed. She knew how it sounded, like the overactive imagination of someone who'd watched too many horror movies. But she also knew what she'd seen, and the memory of that still figure watching their window filled her with dread. The next morning brought a discovery that validated Olivia's fears. As James walked out to check on the boat, he called back to the house with confusion in his voice. "Liv, come look at this." Olivia hurried to the dock, her stomach already nodding with anticipation. There, clearly visible in the morning light, were wet footprints leading from the water's edge to the end of the dock and back again. The prints were human-sized, definitely made by bare feet, and they were still damp despite the warm morning air. James knelt down to examine the prints more closely. "These are fresh," he said, his voice now carrying the same unease that had plagued Olivia. "Someone was definitely here last night." They followed the trail of footprints, which led from the dock to the edge of their property, before disappearing into the thick woods that surrounded the lake. There were no signs of a boat or vehicle, no indication of how the mysterious visitor had arrived or departed. The family spent the rest of the day in an uneasy state. Olivia found herself constantly checking the windows and doors, while James quietly searched the property for any signs of camping or hiding places. The children, sensing their parents' tension, stayed closer to the house and asked fewer questions about swimming or exploring. As evening approached, Olivia made a decision that would have been unthinkable just days before. "We're leaving in the morning," she announced as they sat around the dinner table. "I'm not staying here another night." James looked like he wanted to argue, but the evidence of the footprints had shaken him too. "Maybe we should call the police," he suggested. "Let them know someone's been trespassing." Olivia nodded, but she knew that reporting wet footprints to the authorities would likely result in little more than a notation in some report file. The lake house had always been their sanctuary, but now it felt violated, watched, no longer safe. As they packed their belongings the next morning, Olivia took one last look at the dock where the mysterious visitor had stood. The fog was rolling in again, and she could almost imagine seeing that dark figure materializing from the mist. Forever watching, forever waiting. The Thompson family never returned to Lake Meredith. Olivia put the property up for sale within a month, despite James's protests that they were letting fear drive them away from 3 generations of family history. But Olivia knew what she'd seen, and she knew that some mysteries were better left unsolved. The lake house sold quickly to a young couple from the city, eager for their own peaceful retreat. Olivia never told them about the midnight footprints, but she often wondered if they too would discover that some visitors come calling in the fog, leaving only wet traces of their presence and an overwhelming sense that they were never truly alone. Let's move to our second story. Ethan had always been a solo traveler, finding solace in the quiet moments that came with exploring remote destinations alone. In August 2018, he discovered what he thought would be the perfect getaway. A secluded lake house rental nestled deep in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. The property listing had promised complete privacy and tranquil waters. And after months of working grueling 12-hour days as a software engineer in Silicon Valley, Ethan craved nothing more than a week of digital detox surrounded by nature. The lake house sat on the shores of Whispering Pine Lake, a small body of water so remote that Ethan's GPS had lost signal during the final 3 miles of his journey down winding dirt roads. The cabin itself was a rustic A-frame structure built sometime in the 1970s, with knotty pine walls, a stone fireplace, and large windows that offered panoramic views of the lake. According to the property owner, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the cabin had been in her family for decades, serving as a peaceful retreat for writers, artists, and anyone seeking to escape the modern world's constant connectivity. Ethan arrived on a Sunday afternoon in late August, when the summer heat was beginning to give way to the crisp promise of autumn. He spent his first day settling in, unpacking his minimal belongings and familiarizing himself with the cabin's quirks. The kitchen was well stocked with vintage appliances, the bedroom loft accessed by a steep wooden staircase, and a small boathouse sat at the end of a weathered dock that extended into the pristine lake waters. Everything seemed perfect for the peaceful retreat he had envisioned. The first night passed without incident. Ethan fell asleep to the gentle sounds of water lapping against the shore and the distant call of night birds. He woke refreshed, spent the day kayaking and reading on the deck, and looked forward to a full week of such tranquility. But it was on his second night that the disturbances began, starting with what seemed like an innocent sound that would escalate into something far more sinister. At exactly 3 a.m., Ethan was jolted awake by a series of deliberate knocks on the large picture window that faced the lake. The sound was unmistakable. 3 sharp raps, pause, 3 more raps, pause, then silence. Ethan lay in bed for several minutes, listening intently, but the knocking didn't resume. He convinced himself it must have been a branch blown against the window by the night breeze, though he couldn't recall hearing any wind when he'd gone to bed. The next morning, Ethan thoroughly inspected the exterior of the cabin. There were no overhanging branches near any of the windows, and the night had been completely still. He found no scratches on the glass, no signs of impact, nothing that could explain the precise knocking sound he'd heard. Still, he maintained his rational skepticism, determined not to let his imagination run wild during what was supposed to be a restorative vacation. The second night brought more than just knocking. At 3 a.m. sharp, the same 3-rap pattern echoed from the window, but this time it was accompanied by what sounded like whispered voices just beyond the glass. Ethan strained to make out words, but the whispers were too faint and seemed to come from multiple sources, creating an overlapping murmur that was both hypnotic and deeply unsettling. The combination of knocking and whispers lasted for exactly 10 minutes before stopping as abruptly as it had begun. This time, Ethan didn't wait until morning to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and went outside, scanning the area around the window where the sounds had originated. The beam of his flashlight revealed nothing but undisturbed pine needles and the normal debris of a lakeside forest floor. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been standing near the cabin. The lake stretched out before him, calm and empty under the star-filled sky. By the third night, Ethan was dreading the approach of 3 a.m. He tried staying awake, positioning himself near the window with his flashlight ready. But despite his best efforts, he found himself dozing fitfully in the chair he'd pulled up to keep watch. He was startled awake not by knocking this time, but by the sound of footsteps moving slowly across the ceiling above him. The steps were deliberate and heavy, moving from one end of the loft to the other with the purposeful gait of someone who belonged there. Ethan's blood ran cold as he realized the impossibility of what he was hearing. The loft bedroom was directly above him, but he was the only person in the cabin. He had locked all the doors before bed and had heard no one enter. The footsteps continued for several minutes, accompanied by the creaking of old floorboards under weight. Occasionally, the steps would pause, as if whoever was up there was listening or examining something, before resuming their methodical journey back and forth across the small space. Gathering his courage, Ethan climbed the steep stairs to the loft, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of him. The small bedroom was exactly as he'd left it. Bed made, his clothes folded neatly on the dresser, windows locked and undisturbed. There was nowhere for an intruder to hide in the compact space, and yet the footsteps had been unmistakably real. As he stood in the loft, trying to make sense of what he'd heard, the knocking began again on the window downstairs. The same 3-rap pattern that had become his nightly torment. The fourth night brought the most terrifying escalation yet. At 3 a.m., all the previous phenomena occurred simultaneously. The knocking came from multiple windows around the cabin. The whispers seemed to emanate from both inside and outside the walls. and the footsteps moved not just across the loft, but throughout the entire structure. It was as if the cabin had become the center of some invisible gathering, with unseen entities moving freely through spaces that should have been secure. But it was what Ethan discovered the next morning that truly shattered his resolve to stay. While exploring the property in daylight, searching for any rational explanation for the nighttime disturbances, he decided to investigate the old boathouse at the end of the dock. The structure was smaller than it had appeared from the cabin, with a single room that housed an ancient rowboat and various pieces of fishing equipment. But hanging from the rafters, almost hidden in the shadows, were dozens of small dolls made from twigs, string, and what appeared to be animal bones. The dolls were crudely constructed but arranged with deliberate care, each one slightly different but sharing certain disturbing characteristics. They all faced toward the cabin, their twig arms positioned as if reaching or grasping, and many had small stones where eyes should be. Some were bound with red string, others adorned with feathers or small pieces of fabric that looked like they'd been torn from clothing. The collection gave the impression of a shrine or altar, created by someone with very specific and unsettling intentions. Ethan's hands trembled as he photographed the dolls with his phone, though he doubted anyone would believe what he'd found. The discovery transformed his understanding of the nightly disturbances from possible supernatural phenomena to something potentially more sinister. Someone had been using this property for purposes that had nothing to do with peaceful retreats, and the elaborate arrangement of dolls suggested a level of obsession and ritual that made Ethan's skin crawl. That afternoon, Ethan called Mrs. Hartwell to ask about the boathouse and its contents. Her reaction was immediate and telling, a sharp intake of breath followed by a long pause before she spoke. "I was hoping someone had cleared those out," she said finally, her voice strained. "I've tried to have them removed several times, but they always come back. The previous caretaker said they've been appearing there for years, and anyone who disturbs them experiences difficulties." When Ethan pressed for more details, Mrs. Hartwell reluctantly explained that multiple guests had reported similar nighttime disturbances over the past decade. The experiences were so consistent and disturbing that she'd stopped renting the property to families with children and had been considering selling it altogether. "I probably should have warned you," she admitted, "but I was hoping the activity had stopped. It sometimes goes quiet for months at a time." Ethan felt a mixture of vindication and fury. He wasn't losing his mind, but he'd been deliberately misled about the nature of the property he'd rented. Mrs. Hartwell offered to refund his money if he wanted to leave early, but Ethan decided to stay one more night, driven by a combination of curiosity and stubborn determination to understand what was happening. The fifth night was his last. At 3 a.m., the full symphony of disturbances began as usual. But this time Ethan was ready. Instead of cowering in his bed or investigating with trembling hands, he sat calmly in the main room and spoke aloud to whatever presence seemed to inhabit the space. "I know you're here," he said to the empty cabin. "I've seen your dolls. What do you want?" The response was immediate and terrifying. The whispers, which had always been indistinct, suddenly became clear and seemed to come from directly behind his ear. A voice, neither male nor female, but somehow ancient and patient, spoke a single word. "Stay." The word was repeated by multiple voices, creating a chorus that surrounded him from all directions. "Stay, stay, stay." Ethan was packing his belongings within minutes. As he loaded his car in the pre-dawn darkness, he could feel eyes watching him from the boathouse, though he refused to look in that direction. He drove straight through to the nearest town and spent the rest of his vacation in a conventional hotel, trying to process what he'd experienced. Months later, Ethan learned that Mrs. Hartwell had indeed sold the property, but not to another vacation rental company. The new owners were a group of paranormal researchers who had heard rumors about the lake house and wanted to conduct a formal investigation. Their preliminary findings, which Ethan discovered through online forums dedicated to supernatural phenomena, suggested that the property had been the site of some kind of ritualistic activity dating back decades, possibly related to local folklore about entities that lived beneath the lake's surface. Ethan never returned to the Adirondacks, and he never again rented a property that promised complete isolation. Some forms of solitude, he learned, come with a price that no peaceful vacation could justify. The memory of that patient voice urging him to stay haunted his dreams for months. A reminder that some invitations are best politely declined. Let's move to our third story. Charlotte and her 3 college friends had chosen Lake Blackwater for their annual summer reunion in September 2019. Drawn by its reputation as a hidden gem tucked away in the remote wilderness of northern Maine. The 4 friends, Charlotte, Sophia, William, and Benjamin, had maintained their tradition of spending a long weekend together every year since graduating from college. And this year, they decided to rent a rustic cabin that promised adventure and complete disconnection from their increasingly demanding adult lives. Lake Blackwater lived up to its name, with dark waters that reflected the surrounding pine forest like black glass. The lake was narrow and deep, stretching for nearly 3 miles between steep, forested hills that created natural walls around the water. The rental cabin sat on the northern shore, accessible only by a winding dirt road that seemed to disappear into the wilderness. The property came with 2 kayaks, a small motorboat, and a dock that extended into water so deep that you couldn't see the bottom even on the brightest days. The group arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early September, when the autumn air carried the first hints of winter's approach. They spent their first evening grilling on the cabin's deck, sharing stories about their jobs, relationships, and the various directions their lives had taken since their last reunion. Charlotte, now working as a marketing manager in Boston, had been looking forward to this trip for months, eager to reconnect with friends who had known her before. The pressures of career and adult responsibilities had begun to define her daily existence. The first 2 days passed in the relaxed rhythm they'd hoped for. They took turns with the kayaks, explored the lake's hidden coves, and spent hours floating on inflatable rafts while catching up on each other's lives. William, who had become an avid photographer, documented their activities with his camera, capturing moments of spontaneous laughter and the serene beauty of their surroundings. Benjamin, always the planner of the group, had researched local hiking trails and guided them on afternoon walks through the dense forest that surrounded the lake. It was on Saturday night that their peaceful retreat took a disturbing turn. The 4 friends had decided to take an evening paddle, with Charlotte and Sophia sharing one kayak, while William and Benjamin took the other. They planned to watch the sun set from the middle of the lake, then return to the cabin for a late dinner and evening by the fireplace. The plan was simple and safe. They were all experienced paddlers, and the lake's calm waters posed no apparent threat. They launched their kayaks just as the sun began to sink toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The water was perfectly still, broken only by the rhythmic splash of their paddles and the occasional call of a loon from somewhere across the lake. For Charlotte, these moments captured everything she loved about their annual reunions. the sense of friendship, adventure, and temporary escape from the complexities of modern life. They spent nearly an hour on the water, drifting and talking as the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear. When they finally decided to head back to shore, Charlotte and Sophia were trailing behind the boys' kayak by about 50 yards, taking their time and enjoying the peaceful evening. The dock was clearly visible in the distance, illuminated by the cabin's porch lights, and they could see William and Benjamin's kayak steadily making its way toward shore. It was then that Charlotte noticed something that made her blood run cold. A third kayak had appeared on the lake, moving parallel to their course but staying in the shadows near the eastern shore. The mysterious kayak was occupied by a single paddler who seemed to be keeping pace with their group, maintaining a consistent distance that suggested deliberate surveillance rather than coincidental travel. "Sophia, look over there," Charlotte whispered, pointing toward the eastern shore. "Do you see that other kayak?" Sophia squinted into the gathering darkness and nodded with growing concern. "Yeah, I see it. Where did it come from? There wasn't anyone else on the lake when we came out." The two women watched as the mysterious kayak continued its parallel course, never getting closer but never falling behind. The paddler appeared to be alone and moved with the smooth efficiency of someone very familiar with these waters. What disturbed Charlotte most was the sense that they were being watched, studied, evaluated by someone who had appeared from nowhere and seemed to know exactly where they were going. Charlotte called out to William and Benjamin, who were now about 100 yards ahead of them. "Guys, there's another kayak on the lake. Did you see where it came from?" William turned and followed Charlotte's pointing finger toward the eastern shore. Even from a distance, they could see his posture change as he spotted the mysterious paddler. Benjamin immediately began paddling more aggressively toward the dock, clearly sensing the same unease that was growing among the group. As they approached the shore, the mysterious kayak suddenly changed course, moving from the shadows toward the center of the lake with startling speed. The paddler was no longer trying to maintain distance or stay hidden. Instead, they seemed to be positioning themselves to intercept the group before they could reach the safety of the dock. "Paddle faster," Charlotte urged Sophia. But their kayak was heavier and slower than the approaching strangers. The mysterious paddler was now close enough that they could see it was a figure dressed in dark clothing, face obscured by what appeared to be a hood or hat. The kayak itself looked different from the rental models they were using, sleeker, more professional, as if it belonged to someone who spent serious time on the water. William and Benjamin reached the dock first and quickly climbed out of their kayak, with Benjamin immediately running toward the cabin while William remained on the dock, shouting for Charlotte and Sophia to hurry. The mysterious paddler had closed the distance significantly and was now only about 30 yards away from the women's kayak, moving with mechanical precision that suggested this was not a casual encounter. Charlotte's heart pounded as she and Sophia paddled desperately toward the dock, their strokes becoming increasingly frantic as they realized the other kayak was going to reach them before they could make it to safety. The mysterious paddler was now close enough that they could hear the rhythmic splash of the paddle cutting through the water, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the evening. When they were still 20 yards from the dock, the inevitable happened. The mysterious kayak pulled alongside theirs, and for the first time, Charlotte got a clear look at their pursuer. It was a man, probably in his 40s, with weathered features and eyes that seemed to reflect the darkness of the lake itself. He wore dark clothing that looked like it had been designed for stealth, and his kayak was equipped with gear that suggested he was prepared for extended time on the water. You need to leave? The man said in a voice that was calm, but carried an unmistakable threat. This lake isn't safe for people like you. Charlotte and Sophia were too frightened to respond, but they continued paddling toward the dock where William was frantically gesturing for them to hurry. The mysterious man kept pace with their kayak, his presence close enough that Charlotte could have reached out and touched his paddle. I'm not going to hurt you, the man continued, his voice remaining eerily steady. But others will. You need to pack up and leave tonight. Just as Charlotte and Sophia's kayak scraped against the dock, Benjamin emerged from the cabin carrying what appeared to be a rifle. The sight of the weapon caused the mysterious man to immediately begin paddling away from the dock. But he called back over his shoulder with words that would haunt Charlotte for years to come. Check your kayak in the morning, he shouted as he disappeared into the darkness. Then you'll understand why you need to leave. The four friends spent the rest of the evening huddled in the cabin, with Benjamin keeping watch by the window while the others tried to process what had happened. They debated calling the police, but their cell phones had no signal, and the nearest town was over an hour away down dark, winding roads. William suggested they pack up and leave immediately, but Charlotte argued that they shouldn't let one strange encounter ruin their long-planned reunion. They eventually decided to wait until morning, taking turns keeping watch throughout the night. Charlotte barely slept, haunted by the memory of the man's calm voice and the way he had appeared and disappeared so effortlessly on the dark water. When dawn finally broke, she was among the first to go outside and examine their kayaks, which they had pulled up onto the shore the night before. What she found made her stomach turn. Someone had cut a series of small holes in the bottom of one of their kayaks, holes that were carefully placed and sized to create a slow leak that would have gradually filled the kayak with water during their next outing. The sabotage was deliberate and calculated, designed to create a life-threatening situation far from shore, where rescue would be impossible. Charlotte realized with growing horror that if they had used the damaged kayak again, whoever was in it would have found themselves sinking in the deep, cold water of Lake Blackwater, potentially too far from shore to swim to safety. The mysterious man hadn't been threatening them. He had been warning them about something far more dangerous than his own presence on the lake. Benjamin examined the cuts more closely and determined that they had been made with a sharp knife, probably within the past few hours. Someone came onto our property during the night, he said grimly. While we were sleeping, they sabotaged our equipment. The group quickly packed their belongings and prepared to leave, but not before William insisted on documenting the damaged kayak with his camera. As they loaded their car, Charlotte kept glancing toward the lake, expecting to see the mysterious kayak reappear. But the water remained empty and still. During the drive back to civilization, they stopped at the first town with cell service and reported the incident to local police. The officer who took their statement listened with a weary expression that suggested he had heard similar stories before. Lake Blackwater has a reputation, he explained. We get reports of unusual activity up there a few times a year. People camping where they shouldn't, trespassing on private property, that sort of thing. Sounds like you ran into one of the local troublemakers. But Charlotte knew it was more than that. The man in the kayak had saved their lives, warning them about a threat they hadn't even realized existed. Someone else had been watching them. Someone who had crept onto their property in the dead of night and sabotaged their equipment with the clear intention of causing harm. Months later, Charlotte discovered through online research that Lake Blackwater had been the site of multiple drowning incidents over the past decade. including several cases where experienced paddlers had mysteriously capsized in calm water. The local authorities had attributed these incidents to equipment failure or user error. But Charlotte wondered if there was a more sinister explanation. The four friends never returned to Lake Blackwater, and their annual reunions moved to more populated, well-monitored destinations. Charlotte often thought about the mysterious man who had warned them, wondering if he was still out there, still watching the lake, still trying to protect unsuspecting visitors from whatever danger lurked beneath its dark surface. She never learned his identity, but she remained convinced that his intervention had saved their lives. The damaged kayak served as a permanent reminder that some threats remain hidden until it's almost too late, and that sometimes the most frightening encounters are the ones that reveal how close you came to a danger you never saw coming. Let's move to our fourth story. In the summer of 1954, newlyweds Theodore and Hazel Morrison thought they had discovered paradise when they rented a charming lake house on the shores of Cedar Point Lake in rural Wisconsin. The property had been advertised as a romantic honeymoon retreat, complete with original hardwood floors, a stone fireplace, and panoramic views of the pristine lake that stretched for miles in every direction. What they found instead was a nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives and ultimately lead to the property being condemned by local authorities. Theodore was a young accountant from Milwaukee who had saved for months to afford a proper honeymoon for his bride. Hazel, a schoolteacher with a love for quiet places and natural beauty, had been enchanted by the photographs of the lake house that the rental agency had provided. The cabin dated back to the 1920s and had been in the same family for generations, passed down through a lineage of owners who had each added their own touches to the rustic structure. The current owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Dorothy Blackwood, had seemed eager to rent the property for the summer, offering the young couple a rate that seemed almost too good to be true. The lake house sat on a small peninsula that jutted into the calm waters of Cedar Point Lake, surrounded by towering oak trees that provided natural privacy and shade during the warm summer months. The interior was decorated with vintage furnishings that gave the place a cozy, lived-in feeling, and the walls were covered with old photographs dating back decades, showing various families who had enjoyed the property over the years. Theodore and Hazel arrived on a Saturday afternoon in late June, their car loaded with wedding gifts and enough supplies for a 2-week stay. The first few days passed like a dream. They spent their mornings fishing from the dock, their afternoons exploring the lake in a small rowboat that came with the property, and their evenings sitting by the fireplace, planning their future together. Hazel delighted in the complete silence of the location, so different from the bustling city life they had left behind. Theodore, who had been working long hours for months to save for their wedding and honeymoon, finally felt himself beginning to relax into the peaceful rhythm of lake life. It was on their 4th night that they first heard the tapping. Theodore was awakened around 2 a.m. by a soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from inside the walls of the bedroom. At first, he thought it might be a mouse or some other small creature that had made its way into the old structure. But the sound was too deliberate, too patterned to be random animal activity. The tapping came in groups of 3, followed by a pause, then 3 more taps, as if someone were trying to communicate through the walls using a simple code. Theodore lay in bed, listening to the pattern repeat for nearly an hour before it finally stopped. He didn't want to wake Hazel, who was sleeping peacefully beside him, so he made a mental note to inspect the walls in the morning for any signs of pest activity. But when daylight came, his examination of the bedroom walls revealed nothing unusual. The tapping had seemed to come from different locations throughout the night, moving from the wall behind their bed to the wall near the window, then to the wall that separated their bedroom from the main living area. The next night, the tapping returned, but this time it was accompanied by what sounded like faint whispers coming from the same locations in the walls. Theodore woke Hazel, who listened with growing alarm as the whispers seemed to move around the room, sometimes seeming to come from directly behind the headboard of their bed. The whispers were too soft to make out individual words, but they had the cadence and rhythm of human speech, as if multiple people were having quiet conversations just out of earshot. "Theodore, there's someone in the walls," Hazel whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "How is that possible?" Theodore, despite his own growing unease, tried to maintain his rational perspective. "Old houses make all kinds of sounds, honey. The wood expands and contracts with temperature changes, and sometimes it can sound almost like voices." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they didn't adequately explain the deliberate nature of what they were hearing. By the sixth night, the phenomena had escalated significantly. The tapping and whispers were now joined by what sounded like footsteps moving between the walls, as if there were hidden passages or spaces that allowed unseen figures to move freely throughout the structure. The sounds seemed to follow them from room to room, and Hazel became convinced that they were being watched by invisible eyes that could see through the walls. During their investigation of the house the next morning, Theodore made a discovery that chilled him to the bone. While examining the wall behind their bed more closely, he noticed that one of the old photographs hanging in the bedroom showed a family gathered on the lake house's front porch. The photograph was dated 1931, and it showed a man, woman, and 3 children posing for the camera. What disturbed Theodore was that the faces in the photograph seemed to match the whispered voices they had been hearing. He could almost imagine the conversations that might have taken place between the family members captured in the image. When he pointed this out to Hazel, she studied the photograph with growing horror. "Theodore, look at their eyes," she said softly. "They're all looking directly at the camera, but it's like they're looking at us, not at the photographer." Theodore tried to dismiss his wife's observation as the product of an overactive imagination fueled by several nights of poor sleep. But he couldn't deny that there was something unsettling about the photograph. The family members seemed to be staring out of the frame with expressions that were difficult to read, not quite smiling, not quite serious, but somehow expectant, as if they were waiting for something to happen. That afternoon, Theodore decided to contact Mrs. Blackwood to ask about the history of the property. When he finally reached her by telephone, her response was evasive and uncomfortable. "Oh, you're hearing the house settling?" she said quickly. "Old places like that are full of creaks and groans. Nothing to worry about." But when Theodore pressed for more specific information about the family in the 1931 photograph, Mrs. Blackwood's tone changed dramatically. "I don't know anything about old photographs," she said sharply. "I inherited that property from my aunt, and I've never spent much time there myself. If you're not comfortable staying there, you're welcome to cut your honeymoon short." The conversation left Theodore with more questions than answers. But it also confirmed his growing suspicion that Mrs. Blackwood was hiding something about the property's history. He and Hazel decided to stay for their planned 2 weeks. But they began sleeping in the living room near the fireplace, hoping that the change of location might provide some relief from the nightly disturbances. The strategy proved unsuccessful. On their 9th night, the whispers grew loud enough that they could finally make out individual words, and what they heard made them question their decision to remain at the lake house. The voices seemed to be calling their names, speaking in the same cadence and rhythm as normal conversation, but with an urgency that suggested the speakers were trying to communicate something important. "Theodore, Hazel, can you hear us?" The whispers seemed to come from directly behind the fireplace, as if the speakers were standing in the chimney. "We've been waiting so long for someone to listen." Hazel grabbed Theodore's arm with a grip that left bruises. "They know our names," she whispered. "How do they know our names?" Theodore's rational mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps Mrs. Blackwood had mentioned their names to previous caretakers or neighbors. Perhaps the voices were just the product of suggestion and fear, their minds creating coherent speech from random sounds. But deep down, he knew that what they were experiencing defied rational explanation. The whispers continued throughout the night, sometimes seeming to come from one location, sometimes from another, but always maintaining the same conversational tone, as if the speakers were simply trying to engage them in friendly dialogue. The content of the whispers was benign. Questions about their honeymoon, comments about the beauty of the lake, observations about the weather. But the delivery was deeply unsettling. On their 10th morning, Theodore made a decision that would prove to be the most important of their honeymoon. Instead of trying to endure the remaining days of their stay, he announced that they would be leaving that afternoon. "I don't care about losing the money," he told Hazel. "Something isn't right about this place, and I'm not going to put you through any more of this." As they packed their belongings, preparing to cut their honeymoon short, the whispers began again. But this time they came during daylight hours and seemed to carry a note of desperation. "Don't leave. Please don't leave us alone again. It's been so long since we've had visitors." Theodore and Hazel loaded their car as quickly as possible. But as they prepared to drive away, Hazel insisted on taking one last look at the photograph that had disturbed them so much. What she saw made her scream with terror. The family in the 1931 photograph had changed position. They were no longer looking at the camera, but were instead turned toward the window, as if they were watching Theodore and Hazel prepare to leave. Theodore rushed to see what had frightened his wife so badly, and he too saw the impossible change in the photograph. The family members were now clearly visible in profile, their faces turned toward the window with expressions of profound sadness and longing. It was as if they were saying goodbye to visitors who had finally heard their voices after decades of silence. The young couple fled the lake house immediately, driving straight through to Milwaukee without stopping. They never spoke publicly about their experience, but Theodore later confided to his brother that the whispers had followed them home, calling to them from the walls of their own apartment for several weeks before finally fading away. 2 years later, Theodore learned through a newspaper article that the lake house had been condemned by local authorities after a series of disturbing incidents involving other renters. The article mentioned that the property had been the site of a tragic fire in 1931 that had claimed the lives of an entire family, and that several subsequent visitors had reported unexplained auditory phenomena that made the property unsuitable for rental. Mrs. Blackwood, it turned out, had been renting the property despite knowing about its troubled history, desperate to generate income from a property that had become impossible to sell. The photograph that had so disturbed Theodore and Hazel was later identified as the last known image of the family who had died in the fire, taken just days before the tragedy that had claimed their lives. Theodore and Hazel never returned to Cedar Point Lake, and they never again rented a property without thoroughly researching its history. The memory of those whispered conversations stayed with them for the rest of their lives. A reminder that some voices continue to speak long after their speakers have been silenced, and that the walls that separate the living from the dead are sometimes thinner than we dare to imagine. The lake house stood empty for several more years before being demolished in 1960. But locals reported that even after the structure was gone, visitors to the site would sometimes hear faint whispers carried on the wind, as if the family who had died there was still trying to communicate with anyone willing to listen. Let's move to our fifth story. Liam and Aurora had been hiking together for 3 years, but their August 2015 backpacking trip to the remote wilderness of northern Montana would be their last. The couple, both experienced outdoors enthusiasts in their late 20s, had chosen the Glacier Peak area specifically for its reputation as one of the most isolated and challenging hiking destinations in the continental United States. What they discovered in those dense forests would test not only their survival skills, but their very sanity. The trail they had chosen was a 50-mile loop that would take them through pristine wilderness areas rarely visited by casual hikers. Liam, a geologist from Seattle, had been drawn to the area by reports of unique rock formations and mineral deposits that could only be found in this particular region. Aurora, a wildlife photographer, was hoping to capture images of the elusive mountain goats and grizzly bears that inhabited the high alpine meadows. Their plan was to complete the loop over 6 days, carrying all their supplies in heavy backpacks and camping at designated wilderness sites along the route. They began their hike on a Tuesday morning in late August, when the weather was still warm, but the first hints of autumn were beginning to show in the changing colors of the aspen trees. The trailhead was located at the end of a long dirt road that had taken them nearly 2 hours to navigate in their pickup truck, and they saw no other vehicles when they parked and shouldered their packs. The isolation was exactly what they had been seeking. A chance to disconnect from the modern world and experience the raw beauty of untouched wilderness. The first 2 days of hiking proceeded without incident. They made good time on the well-maintained trail, stopping frequently to admire the dramatic mountain vistas and to photograph the abundant wildlife. Aurora was particularly excited by the number of bears they spotted from a safe distance, and Liam filled his field notebook with observations about the geological formations they encountered. They camped at designated sites both nights, following all proper wilderness protocols and feeling confident in their preparation and equipment. It was on the 3rd day that their peaceful adventure began to transform into something far more sinister. They had been hiking for about 4 hours when they noticed they were being followed. The sounds were subtle at first, the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves that seemed to come from the trail behind them rather than from the surrounding forest. Liam, who had developed keen observational skills through his geological fieldwork, was the first to notice that the sounds maintained a consistent distance from their position, speeding up when they walked faster and slowing down when they paused to rest. "Aurora, I think there's someone behind us," he said during one of their rest stops, speaking in a low voice that wouldn't carry far in the still forest air. "I've been hearing footsteps for the past hour, and they're definitely human." Aurora listened carefully and soon picked up on the same pattern Liam had noticed. The sounds were rhythmic and deliberate, clearly made by someone wearing boots and moving with purpose. What disturbed her most was the stealth involved. Whoever was following them was making an effort to remain hidden, staying far enough back that they couldn't be seen, but close enough that their presence was detectable to anyone paying attention. The couple decided to test their suspicions by making several sudden changes in their hiking pace and direction. Each time they speeded up or slowed down, the sounds behind them adjusted accordingly. When they stopped abruptly and listened, the footsteps would cease almost immediately, as if their pursuer was also stopping to listen. The pattern was too consistent to be explained by coincidence or by the presence of another hiking party simply traveling in the same direction. By late afternoon, Liam and Aurora had become increasingly concerned about their situation. They were still 2 days away from the nearest trailhead, traveling through terrain that offered few opportunities for evasion or alternative routes. The forest was dense enough that visibility was limited to just a few dozen yards in any direction, making it impossible to get a visual confirmation of who or what was following them. They decided to push on toward their planned campsite, hoping that the approaching darkness might provide some advantage, or that their pursuer would abandon the chase. As evening approached, the pursuit took on a more aggressive character. The sounds behind them grew closer and more distinct, and they began to hear what sounded like whispered conversations between multiple people. The realization that they were being followed by more than one person sent a chill through both hikers. A single person tracking them through the wilderness might have been explained by curiosity or coincidence. But a group suggested more organized and potentially malicious intent. When they reached their planned campsite, Liam and Aurora made a difficult decision. Instead of setting up their tent and spending the night in the exposed clearing, they decided to continue hiking into the darkness, hoping to reach the next checkpoint on their route before their pursuers could close the distance. They switched on their headlamps and began what would become the most terrifying night of their lives. The pursuit through the dark forest was relentless. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of at least 2 people moving through the underbrush with the confidence of individuals who knew the terrain well. The pursuers had also switched on lights, and Liam and Aurora could occasionally catch glimpses of flashlight beams sweeping through the trees behind them. What was most disturbing was that their pursuers no longer seemed to be making any effort to remain hidden. They were closing the distance steadily and appeared to be herding the couple toward some predetermined destination. After hiking for nearly 3 hours in the darkness, Liam and Aurora spotted something that initially filled them with hope. The lights of what appeared to be a building through the trees ahead. As they got closer, they realized it was an old ranger station, a small log structure that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The building was dark except for a few windows that glowed with a dim, flickering light that suggested the presence of oil lamps or candles rather than electric lighting. The couple approached the ranger station cautiously, calling out to announce their presence to anyone who might be inside. Their shouts echoed through the forest without response, but the building clearly showed signs of recent occupation. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and they could see movement behind the lit windows. More importantly, the structure represented potential shelter and possibly a radio or telephone they could use to call for help. When they reached the front door of the ranger station, they found it was locked, but they could hear sounds of activity inside. The scraping of furniture, muffled voices, and what sounded like people moving around in the small space. Liam pounded on the door and shouted for help, explaining that they were hikers who were being pursued by unknown individuals. The sounds inside the building stopped abruptly, as if the occupants were listening to their pleas but choosing not to respond. It was then that they heard the voices of their pursuers, much closer than before, coming from just beyond the tree line that surrounded the ranger station. The voices were clearer now, and what Liam and Aurora heard made their blood run cold. The people following them weren't speaking in the casual tones of fellow hikers, or even the professional manner of law enforcement officers. Instead, they spoke in hushed, excited whispers that suggested they were discussing the couple as if they were prey. "They're at the station," one voice said. just like we planned." "The door's locked from the inside," another voice replied. "They can't get in." "That's fine. We'll wait. They have to come out eventually." The realization that they had been herded toward the ranger station as part of some deliberate plan filled Liam and Aurora with panic. They were trapped between the locked building and their pursuers, with no clear escape route and no way to call for help. The darkness of the forest around them seemed to press in from all sides, and they could hear the sounds of their pursuers spreading out to surround the building. In desperation, Liam began searching for another way into the ranger station, while Aurora kept watch for any sign of their pursuers emerging from the forest. What Liam discovered when he examined the building's rear windows only added to their terror. Through gaps in the curtains, he could see inside the small structure, and what he saw defied explanation. The interior was occupied by two pale, gaunt figures who appeared to be sitting motionless at a small table, staring directly at the window where Liam was looking. The figures were dressed in what looked like old ranger uniforms, but their faces were so pallid and their eyes so dark that they barely looked human. "Aurora, there's something very wrong with the people inside," Liam whispered urgently. "We need to get out of here now." But their options for escape were rapidly diminishing. The sounds of their pursuers were now coming from all directions around the building, and they could see flashlight beams sweeping through the trees as the circle tightened. The couple realized that they had only one chance. They would have to make a break for the forest and try to reach the main trail that led away from the area. Their desperate flight through the dark forest was a nightmare of stumbling over fallen logs, crashing through underbrush, and constantly looking over their shoulders for signs of pursuit. The sounds of their pursuers followed them for what felt like hours, sometimes seeming to come from directly behind them, other times from the sides or even from ahead, as if they were being driven toward some final destination. Just when their strength was beginning to fail and they feared they would be caught, Liam and Aurora stumbled onto a paved road that seemed to appear out of nowhere in the wilderness. The road was narrow and clearly saw little traffic, but it represented a potential escape route and a connection to the outside world. They followed the road for several miles before finally seeing the headlights of an approaching vehicle. The driver who picked them up was a local Forest Service employee who listened to their story with growing concern. He explained that the area they had been hiking through was known for unusual incidents, and that the old ranger station had been abandoned for over a decade after several disturbing events involving both staff and visitors. The building was supposed to be sealed and inaccessible, but reports persisted of lights being seen in the windows and sounds of activity coming from inside. "You're not the first hikers to report being chased out of that area," the Forest Service employee told them. "We've had several incidents over the years, but we've never been able to find any evidence of who's responsible. The official position is that it's probably just local kids playing pranks, but honestly, most of us avoid that part of the forest after dark." Liam and Aurora never reported the full details of their experience to local authorities, partly because they doubted they would be believed, and partly because they weren't sure they could adequately describe what they had seen and heard. They did file a report about being followed and harassed by unknown individuals, but the investigation yielded no results. The couple never returned to the Montana wilderness, and their relationship didn't survive the trauma of that night. Aurora moved to a different state within 6 months, and Liam gave up backpacking entirely, unable to enjoy the solitude and isolation he had once craved. The memory of those pale figures in the ranger station and the coordinated pursuit through the dark forest haunted both of them for years. Years later, Liam learned through online forums dedicated to wilderness mysteries that the Glacier Peak area had a long history of unexplained incidents dating back to the early 1900s. The old ranger station had been the site of several disappearances and deaths, and multiple hikers had reported encounters with individuals who seemed to be part of some kind of organized group operating in the remote wilderness. The Forest Service had quietly discouraged hiking in that particular area, though they had never issued any official warnings or explanations. The experience taught Liam and Aurora that some wilderness areas remain wild for reasons that go beyond simple isolation from civilization. Some places harbor secrets that are better left undisturbed, and some pursuits end only when the pursued reach the safety of the modern world and leave the darkness of the forest behind. Let's move to our sixth story. Isabella had thought that her divorce settlement would bring her peace, but the secluded lake house she'd chosen for her fresh start in the summer of 2021 became the stage for a nightmare that would make her question every shadow and every sound. After 23 years of marriage, Isabella had finally found the courage to leave her controlling husband and start over at age 45. The lake house rental in northern Vermont seemed like the perfect place to heal, right, and rediscover the woman she had been, before decades of emotional manipulation had worn her down. The property was everything the listing had promised. A cozy two-bedroom cottage nestled among towering pines on the shores of Mirror Lake. A pristine body of water that stretched for miles without a single other visible dwelling. Isabella had specifically chosen this location for its complete isolation, craving the silence and solitude that had been so rare during her tumultuous marriage. She arrived on a humid Tuesday in July, her car packed with boxes of books, art supplies, and the few personal belongings she had managed to keep during the divorce proceedings. Isabella's first week at the lake house was everything she had hoped for. She spent her mornings writing in a journal on the screened porch, her afternoons reading in the hammock strung between two ancient oaks, and her evenings watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time in years, she felt truly relaxed, no longer jumping at every sound or constantly checking her phone for angry messages from her ex-husband. The lake house felt like a sanctuary where she could begin to rebuild her sense of self. The first indication that her peaceful retreat was being watched came on her 8th day at the property. Isabella was reading on the dock when her phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief but deeply unsettling. "You look peaceful reading by the water. It's nice to see you relaxing." Isabella's heart immediately began racing as she looked around the empty lake, seeing no boats, no other people, no obvious source for someone who could be watching her. The number had a local area code, but when Isabella tried calling it back, she reached only a disconnected voicemail. She told herself it could be a wrong number, a case of mistaken identity, or perhaps a previous renter who had somehow gotten her information. But the specific reference to her reading by the water suggested that whoever had sent the message was currently watching her, which meant they had to be somewhere close enough to see the dock clearly. Over the next few days, the messages became more frequent and increasingly personal. "You looked beautiful in that blue dress today. I saw you practicing yoga on the deck this morning. Your evening walks around the lake are my favorite part of the day." Each message demonstrated intimate knowledge of Isabella's daily routine and activities, proving that someone was conducting detailed surveillance of her movements. Isabella's sense of safety began to crumble as she realized the extent of the stalking. She started closing all the curtains at night, avoiding the deck and dock during daylight hours, and constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The isolation that had initially been so appealing now felt like a trap, leaving her vulnerable and exposed with no neighbors to call for help and no easy escape route. The messages escalated from mere observation to implied threats. You seem nervous lately. There's no need to be afraid of me. I know you're trying to hide from me, but I can see everything you do. Your ex-husband was right about you needing someone to watch over you. The reference to her ex-husband was particularly chilling, suggesting that her stalker either knew details about her personal life or had somehow made contact with her former spouse. Isabella's attempts to involve law enforcement proved frustrating and largely ineffective. The local sheriff's department took her report seriously, but explained that without more substantial evidence or direct threats, their options were limited. The messages were unsettling but not explicitly threatening, and the remote location made surveillance difficult. They increased patrols in the area and advised Isabella to document everything, but she was essentially left to deal with the situation on her own. The psychological warfare continued for another week, with messages arriving at all hours of the day and night. Sometimes they would reference things that had happened hours earlier. Other times they seemed to predict her actions before she had even decided what to do. You're going to check the locks on the doors now, aren't you? You won't sleep well tonight. I can tell by the way you're moving around the house. The messages created a constant state of anxiety and hypervigilance that left Isabella exhausted and increasingly paranoid. On a particularly hot night in late July, Isabella was startled awake by the sound of footsteps on the wooden deck that wrapped around the cottage. The footsteps were deliberate and slow, circling the house methodically as if someone was checking every window and door. Isabella lay frozen in bed, afraid to move or even breathe too loudly. As the footsteps completed their circuit and then stopped directly outside her bedroom window, the silence that followed was almost worse than the sound of the footsteps. Isabella knew that someone was standing just outside her window, separated from her by only a thin pane of glass and a flimsy screen. She could almost feel eyes watching her through the darkness, studying her fear and enjoying the power they held over her sense of security. The presence remained outside her window for what felt like hours before finally moving away, leaving Isabella too terrified to sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning brought a new level of violation. Isabella discovered that someone had been on the property during the night, leaving behind evidence of their presence that was impossible to ignore. Her car had been moved. Not stolen, just repositioned about 10 feet from where she had parked it. The outdoor furniture had been rearranged in a pattern that spelled out her name when viewed from above. Most disturbing of all, someone had left a bouquet of wildflowers on her doorstep, tied with a ribbon that matched a scarf she had worn the previous day. Isabella's nerves were shattered by the realization that her stalker had been so close to her while she slept, moving freely around the property and handling her possessions. The idea that someone had been watching her closely enough to notice and remember details about her clothing was particularly unsettling. She felt completely exposed and vulnerable, as if her every movement was being cataloged and analyzed by an unseen observer. The messages that day took on a more possessive tone. Did you like my flowers? I picked them especially for you. You looked so peaceful sleeping last night. I stood outside your window for a long time just watching you breathe. I know you're thinking about leaving, but you can't run from me forever. I'll always be able to find you. The escalation from watching to actually approaching the house marked a dangerous new phase in the stalking behavior. Isabella made the decision to install a trail camera near the front door, hoping to capture evidence of her stalker's identity. The camera was motion-activated and designed to take photos whenever someone approached the cottage. She positioned it carefully, disguising it among the natural vegetation and programming it to send images directly to her phone. For the first time since the stalking began, Isabella felt like she was taking some control over the situation. The trail camera's first capture came 2 nights later. Isabella was alerted by her phone that motion had been detected, and she opened the app to view the image with a mixture of hope and dread. What she saw made her blood run cold. The photograph showed a figure standing directly in front of the camera, close enough that the motion sensor had been triggered. But the person was wearing a dark hood that completely obscured their features. More disturbing was the fact that the figures seemed to be looking directly at the camera, as if they knew exactly where it was positioned and were deliberately posing for the photograph. The image was clear enough to show that the stalker was of medium height and build, wearing dark clothing that would make them nearly invisible in the nighttime forest. But the most chilling detail was visible in the person's hands. They were holding Isabella's car keys, which she was certain she had left on the kitchen counter inside the locked cottage. The realization that her stalker had somehow gained access to her temporary home while she was inside filled her with a terror that made her physically ill. Isabella immediately called the sheriff's department, but their response was limited by the same jurisdictional and evidentiary issues that had hampered their earlier investigations. The photograph was certainly evidence of trespassing, but the hooded figure was unidentifiable, and proving the connection between the trespasser and the text messages remained problematic. The deputies who responded to her call were sympathetic but honest about the limitations of what they could do to protect her. The final message Isabella received was different from all the others. Instead of the usual surveillance reports or veiled threats, this message contained information that made her realize the true extent of the danger she faced. "I know you're planning to leave tomorrow. I've been watching you pack. But before you go, you should know that I have copies of your house keys from when you lived with your husband. I know where you're going next, and I'll be waiting for you there." The message revealed that her stalker had somehow obtained detailed information about her personal life, including her living arrangements and future plans. The reference to having copies of her keys suggested either a connection to her ex-husband or access to information that should have been completely private. Isabella realized that leaving the lake house wouldn't necessarily end her ordeal. She was dealing with someone who had the resources and determination to continue the stalking regardless of her location. Isabella packed her belongings that night and left the lake house before dawn, driving straight to a women's shelter in a different state where she could receive professional help and protection. She never returned to Vermont, and she never learned the identity of her stalker. The trail camera was left behind in her haste to escape, and she often wondered if it continued to capture images of the hooded figure returning to the empty cottage, searching for the woman who had finally found the courage to run. The experience at the lake house taught Isabella that sometimes the greatest threats come not from strangers in dark alleys, but from the invisible watchers who study our routines and vulnerabilities with patient persistence. She eventually rebuilt her life in a new city, but she never again sought the kind of isolation she had once craved. Some forms of solitude, she learned, come with a price that no amount of peace and quiet can justify. The lake house continued to be rented to unsuspecting visitors, and Isabella often wondered if her stalker had simply moved on to a new target or if they were still waiting in the shadows of Mirror Lake, watching and following and leaving flowers on doorsteps for whoever happened to be staying in the cottage where she had once thought she would find sanctuary. Let's move to our 7th story. In the summer of 1993, siblings Lucas and Chloe Whitmore discovered that some childhood memories are too terrifying to forget, even decades later. The brother and sister, ages 10 and 8 respectively, were spending their annual summer vacation at their grandfather's lake house on Moonrise Lake in rural Minnesota. What began as an innocent exploration of a mysterious island would become a nightmare that would haunt both children well into their adult lives. Their grandfather, Samuel Whitmore, had owned the lakeside property for over 30 years, and it had served as the gathering place for multiple generations of family reunions and summer vacations. The lake house was a sprawling log cabin that sat on a small peninsula, offering panoramic views of the pristine lake and its many hidden coves. Moonrise Lake was known for its crystal-clear waters and the dozens of small islands that dotted its surface, each one covered with dense forest and connected to the mainland only by the courage of swimmers or the availability of small boats. Lucas and Chloe had been visiting their grandfather's lake house every summer since they were old enough to travel, and they had always been fascinated by Pine Island, a heavily forested landmass that sat about half a mile from the main shore. The island was larger than most of the others on the lake, probably covering about 10 acres, and it was topped by what appeared to be the ruins of an old house that had been abandoned for decades. Their grandfather had always forbidden them from swimming to the island or taking the rowboat there without adult supervision, but he had never explained why this seemingly harmless piece of land was off limits. The summer of 1993 was particularly hot and dry, and the lake's water level had dropped significantly from its normal height. The lower water revealed sandbars and rocky areas that were normally submerged, creating new pathways between some of the smaller islands and making Pine Island seem more accessible than it had in previous years. Lucas, who was becoming increasingly adventurous as he approached his teenage years, became obsessed with the idea of exploring the Forbidden Island and discovering what secrets it might hold. On a particularly sultry afternoon in late July, while their grandfather was napping in his favorite chair on the porch, Lucas convinced Chloe to join him in a swimming expedition to Pine Island. The water was warm and inviting, and the distance seemed manageable for two strong swimmers who had been playing in the lake since early childhood. They slipped into the water quietly, not wanting to wake their grandfather, and began the long swim toward the mysterious island. The swim took longer than they had anticipated, and by the time they reached the rocky shore of Pine Island, both children were exhausted and slightly winded. The island was more forbidding up close than it had appeared from the mainland, with dense underbrush and towering pine trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The ruins of the old house were visible through the trees, and Lucas and Chloe could see that it had once been a substantial structure, probably built sometime in the early 1900s. As they explored the island's shoreline, looking for the easiest path to the ruins, they began to hear sounds that seemed out of place in the wilderness setting. The sounds were human voices, but they were faint and seemed to come from the direction of the old house. Lucas, ever the leader, insisted that they investigate, despite Chloe's growing reluctance to venture further into the island's dark interior. The path to the ruins was overgrown and difficult to navigate, forcing the children to push through thorny underbrush and climb over fallen logs. As they got closer to the house, the voices became clearer, and they could make out what sounded like children playing and laughing. The sounds were particularly puzzling because Lucas and Chloe had seen no other boats on the lake, and they couldn't imagine how other children could have reached the island. When they finally reached the clearing where the old house stood, what they found defied all explanation. The structure was indeed in ruins, with a collapsed roof and walls that had partially crumbled from decades of neglect. But in the overgrown yard that surrounded the house, they could see the shadows of children playing what appeared to be a game of tag. The shadows moved with purpose and energy, running between the trees and calling out to each other. But there were no actual children creating the shadows. Lucas and Chloe stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, watching the impossible scene unfold before them. The shadow children seemed to be having the time of their lives, laughing and playing with the carefree abandon that both siblings recognized from their own summer adventures. But the absence of physical forms to create the shadows made the scene deeply disturbing, as if they were witnessing an echo of childhood joy that had somehow become permanently imprinted on the island. The shadow children seemed to notice the presence of the living visitors, and their game gradually stopped as they gathered in a group near the ruins of the old house. Lucas and Chloe could see the shadows turning toward them, and they had the distinct impression that they were being studied by invisible eyes. The silence that followed was broken by what sounded like whispered conversations among the shadow children, though no words were clear enough to understand. Chloe, who had been increasingly frightened by the bizarre scene, tugged on her brother's arm and whispered urgently, "Lucas, we need to leave. Now." But Lucas remained transfixed by the shadow children, who seemed to be beckoning them to come closer to the ruins. The shadows were gesturing in a way that suggested invitation, as if they wanted the living children to join their eternal game. It was then that they heard their grandfather's voice, carried across the water by the still summer air. "Lucas, Chloe, where are you?" The sound of his worried calls broke the spell that had held the children captive, and they suddenly realized how long they had been away from the lake house. The sun was beginning to set, and their grandfather would be frantic with worry about their disappearance. As they turned to leave the clearing, the shadowed children seemed to sense their departure and began moving more frantically, as if trying to prevent them from leaving. The whispered conversations became more urgent, and Lucas and Chloe could swear they heard voices calling their names, begging them to stay and play. The shadows began following them as they hurried back through the forest, always staying just at the edge of their vision, but never quite disappearing. The swim back to the mainland was terrifying, not because of the physical challenge, but because of the psychological pressure of feeling watched and followed. Both children kept looking back toward Pine Island, expecting to see the shadow children somehow pursuing them across the water. The island seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and they could see strange lights flickering among the trees where the old house stood. When they finally reached the familiar shore of their grandfather's property, Samuel Whitmore was waiting for them with a mixture of relief and anger that was typical of adults who had been scared by children's thoughtless adventures. But his expression changed when he saw the fear in their faces and heard their breathless account of what they had experienced on Pine Island. "I should have told you the story years ago," their grandfather said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. "I was trying to protect you from something that would give you nightmares, but I ended up putting you in danger instead." Samuel led them to the porch and, as the sun set over Moonrise Lake, told them the tragic history of Pine Island that he had been hiding for years. In 1934, a wealthy family named the Harrisons had built a summer home on the island, bringing their 5 children there for what they hoped would be the perfect vacation retreat. The family had been happy there for 3 summers, with the children spending their days swimming, exploring, and playing elaborate games of hide-and-seek among the island's dense forests. But in the summer of 1937, tragedy struck when a severe storm swept across the lake, trapping the family on the island as their house caught fire from a lightning strike. The parents and all 5 children died in the blaze, and their bodies were never recovered from the ruins. Local authorities assumed they had been consumed by the intense fire, but strange reports began almost immediately from fishermen and boaters who claimed to see children playing on the island, even though it was known to be uninhabited. The island has never been the same since that night, Samuel explained to his wide-eyed grandchildren. People have been seeing those shadow children for over 50 years, and anyone who gets too close to the ruins has the same experience you just had. They try to get you to stay, to join their game, and some folks say that anyone who stays too long never makes it back to the mainland. The story explained why Samuel had always forbidden them from visiting Pine Island, and why he had seemed so genuinely frightened when he realized where they had gone. The shadow children weren't malevolent, but they were lonely, desperate for playmates to join them in their eternal games. For living children, the temptation to stay and play could be overwhelming, especially when the shadows seem so friendly and welcoming. Lucas and Chloe never spoke publicly about their experience on Pine Island, but the memory of the shadow children haunted both of them for years. Lucas, now in his 40s, still has nightmares about the island and refuses to take his own children to visit their great-grandfather's lake house. Chloe moved to a city far from any large bodies of water and has never again gone swimming in a natural lake. Samuel Whitmore sold the lake house property within 2 years of the incident. Unable to bear the constant reminder of how close he had come to losing his grandchildren to the same tragedy that had claimed the Harrison family decades earlier. The new owners were not told about the island's history, and Samuel often wondered if they too would eventually discover the shadow children playing their eternal games among the ruins. Pine Island still sits in the middle of Moonrise Lake, still covered with dense forest, still topped by the crumbling remains of the Harrison family's summer home. Local fishermen still report seeing children playing in the ruins, and occasionally a curious visitor will swim out to investigate the mysterious island. Most return with stories similar to what Lucas and Chloe experienced, but a few have never returned at all, leaving only empty boats drifting on the lake's surface and families wondering what happened to their missing loved ones. The island serves as a reminder that some tragedies leave permanent scars on the landscape, and that the boundary between the living and the dead is sometimes thinner than we dare to imagine. For Lucas and Chloe, the memory of the shadow children represents both the innocence of childhood and the terrible realization that some games are never meant to end, and some playmates are never meant to grow up. The experience taught them that curiosity can be a dangerous thing, especially when it leads to places where the past refuses to stay buried. They learned that their grandfather's warnings had been born not from arbitrary authority, but from genuine love and the hard-won wisdom of someone who understood that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Let's move to our 8th story. Noah and Ava Morgan had spent most of 2024 dreaming about their upcoming wedding and the lake house honeymoon that would follow. A week of total seclusion at the newly renovated glasswater cabin on remote Lake Sylvan in northern Oregon. The listing promised modern amenities, a private dock, and panoramic windows that seemed to float above the dark, mirror-still water. For two city dwellers who dealt daily with traffic, deadlines, and constant notifications, the idea of an unplugged getaway felt perfect. They arrived on a cool Monday evening in late October. The trees ringing the lake were already stripped bare, their skeletal branches clawing at a slate-gray sky. The real estate company had left the cabin lights glowing, and soft ambient music drifted through hidden ceiling speakers, part of the integrated smart home package that could be controlled entirely by a phone app. Ava marveled at the minimalist design. Pale cedar walls, a glass railing on the loft, and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the moonlit lake like an ever-changing painting. Noah unloaded their bags, then locked the Tesla's charger into place beside the utility shed. Miles of forest lay between them and the nearest town. But with solar panels and backup batteries, the brochure boasted, the cabin was fully self-sustaining. The first night felt enchanted. They cooked pasta, opened a bottle of red wine, and curled up on the sofa, while rain whispered across the glass panes. At 11 p.m., they walked the length of the dock, breathed in the wetwood scent, and watched vapor rise off the lake. Somewhere across the water, an owl hooted. When a gust of wind rattled the wind chimes, Ava laughed and squeezed Noah's hand. "No cell service," she said. "It's like the world can't find us here." That sense of invisibility shattered at 1:17 a.m. Ava bolted upright in bed, convinced she'd heard someone call her name. Noah, half asleep, assured her she'd been dreaming. But Ava insisted the voice, low, gravelly, and far too close, had come from inside the cabin. They searched every room, even the crawl space, and found nothing. Eventually, Ava drifted back to sleep. Noah lay staring at the ceiling, uneasy but unwilling to admit it. Day 2 dawned, bright and untroubled. They kayaked along the foggy shoreline, snapped photos of herons lifting off the reeds, and tried to laugh away the night's strangeness. That evening, while Noah grilled vegetables on the deck, Ava explored the loft and discovered a leather-bound guest journal. The first few pages were filled with the usual vacation notes. Amazing sunsets and saw otters. But the final entry stopped her cold. September 14th, 2024, 3 a.m. If you hear it whisper your name, do not answer. If you see its reflection in the glass, do not move. One more night and we are gone for good, if the power holds. No signature, no explanation. Ava read the lines 3 times, then snapped the book shut, just as Noah called her down for dinner. That night, clouds devoured the moon, and winds slashed at the water. At 12:42 a.m., the cabin's smart lights flickered twice, dimmed, then steadied. Noah grabbed his phone to run a diagnostic, but the control app wouldn't load. 30 minutes later, every bulb died simultaneously. The music cut off mid-note, and the bathroom mirror emitted an electronic pop as its defogging strip shorted out. Total blackout. Noah fetched flashlights while Ava fumbled for the gas fireplace switch. The moment the beam of Noah's flashlight skimmed across the living room window, he froze. Beyond the glass, less than 6 feet away, a silhouette stood on the deck. Tall, angular, its outline shimmering as though stitched from shadows. He jerked the light back. The figure vanished. "Battery surge," he muttered without conviction. "Reflections? Our eyes are adjusting." Ava's voice trembled. But it wasn't reflecting us. It was listening. With the generators supposedly seamless, a blackout made no sense. Noah went to the utility shed. The batteries were at full charge, breakers untripped, solar inverters humming. Yet the cabin remained dark. He hurried back, heart thudding, and found Ava waiting with both flashlights. She'd disabled the front door's auto lock after an alert popped up. Someone had attempted remote access to the cabin system at 1:08 a.m. They decided to ride out the night in the master bedroom. Door bolted, both flashlights trained on the hallway. Hours dragged past. Rain intensified into a drum roll on the roof, then stopped abruptly, leaving an almost painful quiet. Somewhere downstairs, a single floorboard creaked. Noah tensed. The creak repeated, slow, measured steps pacing the great room floor. Ava whispered, "It's walking where we walked." Footsteps paused beneath the loft ladder. A metallic clink followed, like fingernails tapping the rungs. Then the steps transferred to the kitchen tile, sticky sounds of bare feet on stone. Noah's throat constricted. He realized the figure, the thing, was retracing their exact movements from earlier that evening, as if replaying memories it had harvested from the cabin. Adrenaline finally overpowered dread. Noah flung the bedroom door open and swept the flashlight beam across the kitchen. Empty. But the refrigerator screen, despite the power failure, glowed with a single line of text. "Welcome back. Turn around." Noah did. A dark shape loomed at the end of the hallway, taller now, its edges rippling like smoke. It didn't advance. It simply vibrated, humming with a subaudible frequency that prickled the skin. Noah staggered backward, slammed the door, and shoved a dresser against it. Ava, clutching her phone, tried calling 911, but there was no signal, only a harsh burst of static that resolved into a whisper. "Ava." They both heard it, not through the phone's speaker, but from inside the room. Then silence returned. The house felt as though it were holding its breath. At first light, the power returned. Every device rebooted, lights blazed, music resumed at low volume. Noah and Ava emerged shakily to find the cabin exactly as they'd left it, except for the bathroom mirror. A pitch-black handprint, monstrous in size, stained the fogged glass. 5 elongated fingers radiated outward, tapering to needle points. Beneath the print, traced in moisture, was a new message. "Stay daylight." Ava begged to leave immediately. Noah packed, but the Tesla's dashboard displayed 0% battery. Every cable was intact, yet the vehicle wouldn't accept power. Stranded, they tried contacting the rental agent through the landline. Dead. Then by satellite Wi-Fi, no signal. Noah remembered the kayak and proposed paddling across the lake to reach a ranger's outpost marked on the trail map. Ava agreed. They loaded essentials, pulled on life vests, and pushed off. Halfway across, a dense fog rolled in, reducing visibility to mere yards. The water, calm moments earlier, began swirling in lazy spirals around the boat, as though something massive churned beneath. Ava pointed behind them. The lake house windows, now distant squares of white, held the silhouette again, darker than ever. Standing inside, hand pressed against the glass in perfect mimicry of the print on the bathroom mirror. A deep vibration rose through the hull. The kayak rocked. Noah dug his paddle urgently, but the water clung like syrup. Beneath the fog, an oily shadow unfurled, pacing the motion of the boat. Then the stern dipped violently. Ava screamed as a black, talon-tipped hand breached the surface, slapped the hull, and vanished. Another strike followed, closer to Noah. The third lifted the entire kayak, 6 inches before letting it slam back down. Desperation lent Noah strength. He paddled with ferocity, and at last the shadow receded, as though the entity were tethered to the house and could pursue them no farther. They reached the opposite shore, abandoned the kayak, and sprinted through dripping pines until they burst onto an old service road. Hours later, they flagged down a ranger truck driven by Daniel Cruz, who listened with widening eyes. 2 winters ago, he said, a tech entrepreneur had installed the smart home array at Glasswater Cabin, then vanished during a solo stay. The property manager found the place spotless, except for a single black handprint on the refrigerator door. Investigators ruled it a voluntary disappearance. Daniel radioed headquarters. A patrol escorted Noah and Ava to safety. When a maintenance crew arrived at the cabin that afternoon, they found every light blazing, music pounding through the speakers, and the smart thermostat running hot enough to warp the hardwood floors. The crew cut the main breaker. The system shut down. Before leaving, one technician snapped pictures for documentation. In the final photo, taken facing the lakefront windows at dusk, a figure stood on the dock, tall, faceless, hand raised in farewell. Noah and Ava never saw the cabin again. 3 months later, a wind-driven wildfire swept through the region and reduced glasswater to ash. Yet firefighters reported retrieving a single intact artifact from the debris. The bathroom mirror, glass unbroken, framed in charred timber. Scorched across its surface, impossible to wipe away, remained the inky handprint, waiting as if the entity needed only another pane of glass and another pair of unwitting guests to cross the lake and come home. The officers arrested the intruder when they found him hiding in the attic the next morning. The man, identified as Marcus Thorne, was a local photographer who had been living in the woods surrounding the lake house for nearly 2 weeks. Thorne had apparently developed an obsession with the Harrison family after observing them during their first days at the property. He had been using his professional photography skills to document their activities while planning what he later described to investigators as joining their family permanently. During questioning, Thorne revealed that he had been entering the house regularly, using a key that he had obtained by making a wax impression of the lock during the family's first day at the property. He had been moving through the house at night, studying the family's possessions and routines, and had been living in the attic during the day while the family was outside. The photographs found in the attic were part of what he called his family album, documenting what he believed was his integration into their household. Thorne's mental health evaluation revealed a history of obsessive behavior and previous stalking incidents that had never been reported to authorities. He was charged with stalking, breaking and entering, and possession of surveillance equipment, and was sentenced to 2 years in prison, followed by mandatory psychiatric treatment. The Harrison family learned that they had been incredibly fortunate that Thorne's obsession had been discovered before it could escalate to violence. The experience shattered the family's sense of security and trust in what had initially seemed like a perfect vacation destination. They left the lake house immediately and spent the remainder of their planned vacation time in a hotel in a more populated area. Michael and Charlotte found themselves constantly checking locks and looking over their shoulders, while Sophia and Oliver struggled with nightmares about the man who had been watching them from the shadows. The Harrison family never returned to Clearwater Lake, and they never again rented an isolated vacation property. The incident taught them that privacy and seclusion come with risks that no amount of scenic beauty can justify. Michael, who had initially been skeptical of his son's observations about the attic ladder, learned to trust his family's instincts and to take seriously any signs that something was not quite right. The lake house continued to be rented to other families, but the property management company was required to disclose the stalking incident to future guests. Many potential renters were deterred by the story, but those who did stay were advised to be vigilant and to report any unusual activity immediately. The attic, which had once been marketed as a charming reading nook, was permanently sealed off and is no longer accessible to guests. The experience left the Harrison family with a lasting understanding that some threats come not from strangers who break down doors, but from those who watch and wait and study their victims with patient obsession. Marcus Thorne had been invisible to them for nearly 2 weeks, living in their temporary home and documenting their lives, proving that the most dangerous predators are often those who have the patience to remain hidden until they are ready to strike. Let's move to our 9th story. The Harrison family thought they had found the perfect escape when they rented a spacious lake house on Clearwater Lake in northern Michigan for their 2-week vacation in August 2023. Michael and Charlotte Harrison, along with their teenage daughter Sophia and 12-year-old son Oliver, had been looking forward to this family bonding time for months. The lake house was a 3-story Victorian-style home that had been converted into a vacation rental, complete with modern amenities while maintaining its historic charm and character. The property sat on a bluff overlooking the pristine waters of Clearwater Lake, surrounded by towering maple and oak trees that provided natural privacy and shade during the hot summer days. The house itself was impressive, with wraparound porches, ornate woodwork, and a distinctive third-floor attic that had been converted into a cozy reading nook with dormer windows offering spectacular views of the lake. The rental listing had emphasized the property's authentic Victorian atmosphere and complete privacy, which had appealed to the Harrison family's desire to disconnect from their busy suburban lifestyle. Michael, a corporate lawyer who rarely took time off, had been particularly excited about the opportunity to spend uninterrupted time with his family. Charlotte, a high school principal, was looking forward to reading the stack of novels she had been collecting all year. Sophia, 16 and perpetually attached to her phone, had initially complained about the lack of reliable Wi-Fi, but even she seemed to be warming to the idea of a digital detox. Oliver, the family's natural explorer, was thrilled by the prospect of investigating every corner of the old house and the surrounding forest. The first week of their vacation passed in the relaxed rhythm they had hoped for. The family spent their days swimming in the lake, exploring the nearby hiking trails, and enjoying long meals together on the screened porch. Michael found himself actually relaxing for the first time in months, while Charlotte made significant progress through her reading list. The children seemed to be rediscovering the joy of unstructured play, building elaborate forts in the woods and spending hours fishing from the dock. It was on the evening of their 8th day that Oliver first noticed something unusual about the attic access. He had been exploring the second floor when he discovered that the pull-down ladder to the attic was slightly extended, as if someone had recently used it but hadn't pushed it completely back into place. Oliver was certain that none of the family members had been in the attic that day, and he distinctly remembered the ladder being fully retracted when they had toured the house upon arrival. When Oliver mentioned his observation to his parents, Michael initially dismissed it as a case of the old house settling or perhaps the ladder mechanism working loose due to temperature changes. But Charlotte, who had developed a teacher's instinct for noticing when things were out of place, decided to investigate. She climbed the ladder and found the attic exactly as it had been during their initial exploration. A cozy space with built-in bookshelves, comfortable reading chairs, and windows that offered commanding views of the lake and surrounding forest. Everything appeared normal, but Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the space recently. The reading chair was positioned differently than she remembered, and one of the windows was slightly ajar, letting in a cool breeze that hadn't been there before. She mentioned these observations to Michael, who conducted his own inspection but found nothing definitively out of place. They decided to keep the attic door locked as a precaution, though neither of them could explain why they felt the need for such a measure. The next morning brought a discovery that transformed their concern into genuine alarm. Sophia, who had been assigned the task of making breakfast, found that someone had been in the kitchen during the night. The refrigerator had been opened and items had been moved around, but nothing appeared to be missing. More disturbing was the discovery of muddy footprints on the kitchen floor. Prints that were clearly made by bare feet and were too large to belong to any member of the Harrison family. Michael immediately conducted a thorough search of the house, checking every room, closet, and possible hiding place. He found no signs of forced entry and no indication that any of the doors or windows had been disturbed. The security system, which they had activated before going to bed, showed no record of any breach. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Someone had been in their temporary home while they slept, moving through the house with enough familiarity to navigate in the dark without disturbing the family. The local sheriff's department responded to their call with professional concern, but limited options. Deputy Sarah Martinez explained that isolated lake houses were occasionally targeted by transients or local troublemakers, but the lack of theft or vandalism made this incident unusual. She took photos of the footprints and filed a report, but advised the family that without more substantial evidence or a clearer pattern of criminal activity, there was little law enforcement could do beyond increasing patrols in the area. That evening, Michael made the decision to stay awake and keep watch. He positioned himself in the living room with a clear view of both the front and back entrances, armed with his phone and a flashlight. Charlotte protested that he was overreacting, but Michael's protective instincts had been triggered by the thought of a stranger moving through their house, while his family slept vulnerable in their beds. At 2:30 a.m., Michael was startled awake from a light doze by the sound of movement directly above him. The sounds were coming from the attic, which they had specifically locked after the previous day's discoveries. Michael grabbed his flashlight and quietly made his way to the second floor, where he found the attic ladder fully extended despite the lock that should have prevented its use. The lock itself was lying on the floor, apparently removed from the inside. Michael's heart pounded as he climbed the ladder, flashlight beam dancing ahead of him. When he reached the attic, he found it empty, but there was clear evidence that someone had been there recently. The reading chair was warm to the touch, and the window that Charlotte had found slightly open was now wide open, letting in the cool night air. Most disturbing of all, Michael found a collection of photographs spread across the small table. Photos of his family taken during their vacation, apparently shot from hidden vantage points around the property. The photographs showed the Harrison family swimming in the lake, eating meals on the porch, and relaxing in the living room. The images were taken with a telephoto lens from positions that would have required the photographer to be hiding in the surrounding forest. Some of the photos were taken from angles that suggested the photographer had been very close to the house, possibly even looking through windows. The quality and composition of the images indicated that they had been taken by someone with photographic experience and professional-grade equipment. Michael immediately woke his family and called the sheriff's department. But Deputy Martinez explained that the response time for their remote location would be at least 45 minutes. Michael made the decision to gather his family in the living room and wait for law enforcement to arrive. But as they huddled together on the couch, they heard footsteps moving across the roof directly above them. The footsteps were deliberate and unhurried, as if the person making them was comfortable moving around the property and unafraid of being detected. The sounds moved from the roof to the wraparound porch, where they could hear someone walking slowly around the perimeter of the house. Michael peered through the curtains, but saw nothing in the darkness beyond the porch lights. The footsteps stopped directly outside the front door, and for several long minutes, the family held their breath, waiting for the sound of someone trying to enter the house. When Deputy Martinez finally arrived, accompanied by 2 other officers, they conducted a thorough search of the property, but found no sign of the intruder. However, they did discover something that made Michael's blood run cold. A small campsite hidden in the dense woods about 200 yards from the house. The site was well concealed and showed signs of extended occupation. With a sleeping bag, camping equipment, and most disturbingly, a notebook filled with detailed observations about the Harrison family's daily routines. The notebook contained entries dating back to the beginning of their vacation, documenting their meal times, swimming schedules, and sleeping patterns. The handwriting was neat and methodical, as if the author was conducting some kind of surveillance operation. Some entries included sketches of the house's layout and notes about the family's habits that showed an intimate knowledge of their behavior patterns. "It looks like someone has been watching your family since you arrived," Deputy Martinez explained grimly. This level of surveillance suggests either an obsessive individual or someone with more sinister intentions. "We're going to need to treat this as a potential stalking situation." Let's move to our 10th story. The summer of 2020 had been particularly challenging for everyone. But for young adults Sebastian and Luna, their planned camping trip to remote Whispering Lake in northern Canada represented their first taste of freedom after months of lockdown restrictions. The two 23-year-olds had been dating for 2 years and had been looking forward to this wilderness adventure as a way to reconnect with each other and with nature after being cooped up in their small apartment for most of the pandemic. Whispering Lake was located in a vast wilderness area, accessible only by a network of logging roads that hadn't been maintained in years. The lake itself was roughly 3 miles long and shaped like a crescent moon, with dense boreal forest stretching in all directions as far as the eye could see. Sebastian and Luna had chosen this particular destination specifically because of its remoteness. They wanted to experience true solitude and the kind of pristine wilderness that was becoming increasingly rare in their overpopulated world. They arrived at the lake on a Thursday afternoon in late August, when the summer heat was beginning to give way to the crisp promise of autumn. The drive had taken them nearly 8 hours from their home in Toronto, with the last 2 hours spent navigating increasingly rough roads that tested the limits of Sebastian's aging SUV. When they finally reached the shores of Whispering Lake, they were struck by the absolute silence of the place. No traffic, no aircraft, no human sounds of any kind, just the gentle lapping of water against the rocky shore and the distant call of loons across the water. Their campsite was situated on a small peninsula that jutted into the lake, offering panoramic views of the water and the surrounding forest. Sebastian, who had been an Eagle Scout in his youth, took charge of setting up their tent and organizing their supplies, while Luna, an art student with a passion for photography, began documenting the stunning scenery with her camera. The isolation was exactly what they had been craving. A chance to disconnect from the digital world and reconnect with each other and with the natural environment. The first 3 days of their camping trip unfolded exactly as they had hoped. They spent their mornings exploring the lake in their inflatable kayak, their afternoons hiking the faint game trails that led through the dense forest, and their evenings sitting around their campfire, talking and watching the stars emerge in the unpolluted sky. Luna captured hundreds of photographs, while Sebastian indulged his love of fishing in the lake's clear waters. For the first time in months, both of them felt truly relaxed and at peace. It was on their 4th evening that they first noticed the light across the lake. Sebastian was tending their campfire when Luna called his attention to what appeared to be a signal coming from the opposite shore, nearly 2 miles away. The light was flashing in a deliberate pattern. 3 short flashes, followed by 3 long flashes, then 3 short flashes again. Even though neither of them had formal training in Morse code, they both recognized the universal distress signal, SOS. "Someone's in trouble over there," Luna said, pointing across the dark water toward the source of the flashing light. "We need to help them." Sebastian studied the signal through his binoculars, trying to make out any details about the person or situation creating the distress call. The light appeared to be coming from a flashlight or lantern, and it was positioned near the shoreline on what looked like a small beach or clearing. The pattern was being repeated consistently, suggesting that whoever was making the signal was alert and deliberately calling for help. The couple debated their options. They had no boat other than their small inflatable kayak, which wasn't designed for a 2-mile journey across open water especially at night. Their cell phones had no signal in the remote location, and they had no way to contact emergency services. The nearest road was hours away, and by the time they could drive out and bring back help, it might be too late for whoever was in distress. "We have to try," Sebastian said finally. "If someone's hurt or stranded over there, we might be their only chance." They decided to wait until morning to attempt the rescue, reasoning that the dangerous nighttime crossing would help no one if they capsized in the dark water. Sebastian built up their campfire to create a signal of their own, using a flashlight to send a simple message back across the lake. "We see you. Help coming in morning." The SOS signal stopped briefly, then resumed with what appeared to be increased urgency. That night, neither Sebastian nor Luna slept well. They took turns keeping watch, maintaining their campfire and monitoring the situation across the lake. The SOS signal continued intermittently throughout the night, sometimes flashing steadily for long periods, other times disappearing for hours before resuming. The inconsistency suggested that whoever was making the signal might be injured or running low on battery power. At first light, Sebastian and Luna loaded their kayak with emergency supplies, first aid kit, extra water, energy bars, and a rope that might be useful for rescue operations. The morning was calm and clear, with no wind to complicate their crossing. But the distance still seemed daunting in their small inflatable boat. They had never paddled such a long distance before, and they were acutely aware that if something went wrong, they were miles from any help. The journey across Whispering Lake took them nearly 2 hours of steady paddling. As they approached the far shore, they could see the area where the SOS signal had been coming from, a small sandy beach backed by dense forest. But as they drew closer, they realized something was wrong. There was no sign of a person in distress, no camping equipment, no boat or other means of transportation. The beach was completely empty. Sebastian and Luna beached their kayak and began searching the area, calling out to announce their presence and offer help. They found the source of the SOS signal almost immediately, a small LED flashlight that had been modified to flash automatically, powered by a solar panel and mounted on a wooden stake driven into the sand. The device was clearly homemade, constructed with basic electronic components and designed to operate continuously as long as it received sunlight. The discovery was deeply disturbing. Someone had deliberately created a fake distress signal, knowing that any decent person who saw it would attempt a rescue. But why? Luna suggested that maybe it was just a prank or some kind of art project, but Sebastian's instincts told him that something more sinister was at play. The device had been carefully constructed and positioned to be visible from across the lake, suggesting planning and intent rather than casual mischief. As they examined the fake signal device more closely, they heard the sound of their kayak scraping against the rocky shore behind them. They turned to see a figure emerging from the forest. A middle-aged man wearing dark clothing and carrying what appeared to be a large backpack. The man's appearance was disheveled, and his eyes had the intense, focused look of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Thank you for coming," the man said, his voice calm but somehow wrong, as if he was reciting lines he had practiced many times. "I've been waiting for someone like you to answer my call." Sebastian immediately positioned himself between the stranger and Luna, his protective instincts triggered by the man's strange demeanor and the bizarre situation they had stumbled into. "We came because we thought someone was in distress," Sebastian said carefully. "But it looks like your signal was fake." The man smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Not fake. I was in distress. I've been so lonely here, so isolated. I needed company, and I knew that good people like you would come to help. Now you can stay with me, and I won't be alone anymore." The full horror of their situation became clear as the man began moving toward their kayak. He had lured them across the lake with a fake distress signal, drawing them away from their campsite and their vehicle to this isolated spot where he could trap them. Luna grabbed Sebastian's arm, and they both began backing toward the water. But the man was already between them and their only means of escape. "The kayak belongs to me now," the man said, his voice taking on a more threatening tone. "You can't leave. I've been planning this for so long, watching campers across the lake, waiting for the right people to answer my call. You're exactly what I was looking for." Sebastian and Luna broke into a run, splashing into the shallow water and desperately trying to reach their kayak before the man could intercept them. The stranger was faster than his appearance suggested, and he reached the boat just as Sebastian was trying to push it into deeper water. A struggle ensued, with Luna using her paddle to fend off the man, while Sebastian fought to maintain control of their only means of escape. The fight was brief but intense. The man was clearly desperate, and had the advantage of having planned this encounter. But Sebastian's protective instincts and Luna's fierce determination gave them the edge they needed. When the stranger stumbled and fell into the water, they seized their chance and paddled frantically away from the shore, leaving the man standing waist-deep in the lake, shouting after them. The return journey across Whispering Lake was the most terrifying experience of either of their lives. They paddled with desperate intensity, constantly looking over their shoulders to see if the man was pursuing them somehow. The distance that had seemed manageable that morning now felt endless, and they were haunted by the knowledge that they had no way to know if the stranger had other means of reaching their campsite. When they finally reached their peninsula, Sebastian and Luna immediately began breaking camp, throwing their supplies into the SUV with no regard for organization or care. They had no idea if the man across the lake had a boat hidden somewhere, no way to know if he might circle around by land, and no desire to spend another night in the wilderness with such a dangerous individual nearby. As they drove away from Whispering Lake, Luna used her camera to photograph the fake SOS device they had discovered, wanting to preserve evidence of what they had experienced. The images showed the simple but effective construction of the trap, proof that someone had gone to considerable effort to lure unsuspecting campers into a dangerous situation. They reported the incident to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police when they reached the nearest town. But the investigation proved challenging due to the remote location and the difficulty of accessing the area. Officers eventually reached the lake several days later, but found no trace of the man or his equipment. The fake SOS device was gone, and there was no evidence that anyone had been camping in the area. The experience left Sebastian and Luna with a profound distrust of remote wilderness areas and a new understanding of how isolation can be exploited by those with malicious intent. They never returned to Whispering Lake, and they never again camped in locations so far from civilization that help would be impossible to summon. The memory of the man's calm voice, explaining his need for company, haunted them both. A reminder that some people view other human beings as commodities to be acquired, rather than individuals with their own rights and freedoms. The incident also changed how they viewed distress signals and calls for help. While they remained committed to helping others in genuine emergencies, they learned to be more cautious about situations that seemed too convenient or too perfectly positioned to draw them into danger. The fake SOS signal had been a masterpiece of manipulation, exploiting their natural compassion and desire to help others in need. Sebastian and Luna eventually married and moved to a different city, but they never forgot the lesson they learned at Whispering Lake. They learned that evil can wear the mask of vulnerability, that predators sometimes pose as victims, and that the most dangerous traps are those that appeal to our better angels. The SOS signal that had seemed like a call for help had actually been a siren song, luring them toward a fate that they had escaped only through luck and determination. The lake still sits in the Canadian wilderness, still remote and isolated, still beautiful and dangerous. Other campers have reported seeing mysterious lights across the water. But whether these are genuine distress signals or new versions of the same trap remains unknown. The man who created the fake SOS device was never identified or caught, leaving the disturbing possibility that somewhere in the vast wilderness, someone is still waiting for the next Good Samaritan to answer a call for help that is actually a call to danger. Let's move to our final story. Mateo had always been a meticulous planner, but his decision to spend New Year's Eve alone at a remote lake house in the Adirondacks during the winter of 2025 would prove to be the last entry in his carefully kept journal. The 34-year-old software developer from Brooklyn had been dealing with a difficult year, a painful divorce, the loss of his father to cancer, and the stress of a demanding job that left him feeling burned out and disconnected from any sense of purpose or meaning. The lake house he had rented through an obscure vacation rental website was marketed as a winter solitude retreat, perfect for someone seeking complete isolation and time for reflection. The property sat on the frozen shores of Raven Lake, accessible only by a snowmobile trail that wound through miles of dense forest. The listing had emphasized the property's off-grid authenticity and digital detox environment, promising no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no distractions from the modern world. Mateo arrived on December 30th, driving as far as the plowed road would allow, then switching to the snowmobile he had rented for the final 3 miles to the lake house. The property was exactly as advertised. A small log cabin nestled among snow-laden pine trees, with a stone chimney already sending smoke into the gray winter sky. The caretaker, an elderly local man named Frank, had already stocked the cabin with firewood and basic supplies, and he gave Mateo a brief orientation before disappearing back into the forest on his own snowmobile. The first 2 days passed in the peaceful rhythm that Mateo had been seeking. He spent his mornings writing in his journal, documenting his thoughts about the past year and his hopes for the future. His afternoons were devoted to reading the stack of books he had brought, classic novels he had always meant to read but never found time for. His evenings were spent sitting by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the absolute silence of the winter wilderness. Mateo's journal entries during these first days reflected a man beginning to find some peace after months of turmoil. He wrote about the therapeutic value of solitude, the beauty of the snow-covered landscape, and his growing sense that this retreat might help him process the grief and disappointment that had been weighing him down. He felt hopeful about the coming year and optimistic about his ability to rebuild his life on his own terms. On New Year's Eve, Mateo made his final journal entry, a reflection on the year that was ending and his intentions for the year ahead. He wrote about feeling grateful for the solitude, for the opportunity to step away from the chaos of his normal life and gain some perspective on what really mattered. He described watching the sunset over the frozen lake and feeling a sense of peace that had been absent from his life for months. "Tomorrow I start over," he wrote in his careful handwriting. "Clean slate, fresh beginning. This place has given me exactly what I needed. Silence, space, and time to remember who I am underneath all the noise and pressure. I'm ready to go back to the world. But I'm different now. Stronger, more centered. Whatever happens next, I can handle it." But Mateo never made it to his fresh beginning. On January 1st, 2025, at exactly 6:47 a.m., the winter silence was broken by the sound of a foghorn echoing across the frozen lake. The sound was deep and mournful, completely out of place in the wilderness setting. It came from somewhere far across the lake, from a direction where Mateo had seen no signs of human habitation during his stay. The foghorn sounded 3 times, each blast lasting exactly 10 seconds, with 30-second intervals between each call. Then silence returned to the winter landscape, as if the sound had been imagined rather than heard. But Mateo's journal, left open on the kitchen table, showed that he had been awakened by the sound and had written a hurried note in the margin. 6:47 a.m. Foghorn? No boats on frozen lake. Where is it coming from? When the caretaker Frank arrived the next morning to check on his guest, he found the cabin empty, but with all signs pointing to a sudden and unexpected departure. The fire in the fireplace had burned down to cold ashes, suggesting that it had not been tended since the previous evening. Mateo's belongings remained in the cabin, including his wallet, keys, and the journal that documented his stay. The only thing missing was Mateo himself. Frank conducted a thorough search of the property and the surrounding forest, but found no trace of his guest. The snow around the cabin was undisturbed except for Mateo's own tracks, which led from the cabin to the edge of the frozen lake, and then simply disappeared. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that Mateo had been forced to leave, and no tracks leading away from the lake in any direction. The local sheriff's department launched a full investigation, bringing in search and rescue teams, tracking dogs, and even a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging equipment. The search continued for weeks, covering hundreds of square miles of wilderness, but no trace of Mateo was ever found. The frozen lake was thoroughly searched once the ice began to thin in spring, but no body was recovered from the water. The investigation revealed several disturbing facts about the property and its history. The lake house had been the site of 3 previous disappearances over the past 15 years, all involving solo guests who had vanished without a trace during winter stays. In each case, the missing person had left behind all their personal belongings and had apparently walked out onto the frozen lake, never to be seen again. Local residents, when pressed by investigators, admitted that Raven Lake had a reputation for strange incidents dating back generations. The foghorn sound was a known phenomenon, reported by dozens of visitors over the years, but no source had ever been identified. Some locals claimed that the sound came from an old steamship that had supposedly sunk in the lake in the 1890s. But there was no historical record of such a vessel or such an accident. The property owner, when contacted by investigators, revealed that he had been trying to sell the lake house for years, but had been unable to find a buyer due to its reputation. He had begun renting it to unsuspecting visitors as a way to generate income from a property that had become essentially worthless on the real estate market. He claimed ignorance about the previous disappearances, but investigators found evidence that he had been aware of the property's troubled history. The most disturbing discovery came when investigators found a video camera that Mateo had been using to document his stay. The camera had been set up on a tripod pointing toward the lake, apparently to capture the sunrise on New Year's Day. The final footage showed Mateo walking out onto the frozen lake at dawn, moving with purpose toward the center of the ice. He walked steadily for several minutes, getting smaller and smaller in the frame, until he simply vanished from view. The video showed no signs of the ice breaking or any other obvious explanation for Mateo's disappearance. He appeared to be walking normally, showing no signs of distress or disorientation, until he simply stepped out of the camera's range and was never seen again. The timestamp on the video showed that his disappearance occurred at exactly 6:47 a.m., the same time he had noted hearing the foghorn in his journal. The case remains officially unsolved, But the lake house has been permanently closed to visitors. The property sits empty now, slowly deteriorating in the harsh Adirondack winters. But locals report that the foghorn can still be heard echoing across the frozen lake on quiet winter mornings. Some say that on clear days, you can see a lone figure walking on the ice, always moving toward the center of the lake, never reaching the shore. Mateo's journal, preserved as evidence in the investigation, serves as a haunting reminder of how quickly hope can turn to mystery, how a search for peace can become a descent into the unknown. His final entry, with its optimistic words about fresh beginnings and clean slates, stands in stark contrast to the margin note about the foghorn that would be the last words he ever wrote. The story of Mateo's disappearance has become part of the local folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking solitude in places where the boundary between the natural and supernatural becomes dangerously thin. His fate serves as a reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be solved, and that some calls, whether they come from foghorns or from the depths of frozen lakes, are better left unanswered. If you've made it through all 11 of these chilling tales, you've proven you have the courage to face the darkest corners of lakeside horror. But the terror doesn't end here. Smash that like button if these stories sent shivers down your spine and made you question every shadow dancing on the water. Your support tells us you're ready for more spine-tingling content that will keep you up at night. Subscribe to Verified Fears and ring that notification bell because we're just getting started. Every week, we bring you the most disturbing true stories that prove reality is far more terrifying than fiction. From haunted houses to wilderness nightmares, from urban legends to documented encounters with the unexplained, we dive deep into the darkness so you don't have to. But here's what I really want from you. In the comments below, tell us about your own lake house horror story. Have you experienced something unexplained during a lakeside vacation? Have you heard strange sounds echoing across dark waters? Have you felt eyes watching you from the forest? Share your story. It might just become the centerpiece of our next terrifying compilation. And if you're feeling brave enough to tempt fate, check out our community page where fellow horror enthusiasts share their own encounters with the unknown. But be warned, once you start reading, you won't be able to stop, and you'll never look at peaceful lake houses the same way again. Remember, the water is always watching, the forests are always listening, and somewhere out there in the darkness beyond the dock, something is always waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor to answer its call. Sweet dreams, if you can manage them after tonight.